Shudder is the streaming service with the best selection of horror, thriller, and supernatural movies, series, and originals. From Hollywood favorites and cult classics to original series and critically acclaimed new genre films you won't find anywhere else, streaming uncut and commercial-free right to your favorite devices. And why wait until October to celebrate Halloween? Shudder is once again supersizing the spooky season with 61 days of Halloween, starting right now in September. Shudder has its biggest, best lineup of new movies, new series, and classic favorites ever. The month kicks off with two Shudder originals hot off the film festival circuit: Rental Gone Wrong thriller Superhost on September 2nd, and ghostly chiller Martyr's Lane on September 9th. Then things really heat up with a new season of Creepshow premiering September 23rd. Shudder, the best streaming service for horror and the best for Halloween scares. You can get Shudder streaming on all your favorite devices for $5.99 a month or $56.99 a year, and there's a reason it's called the Netflix of horror. As for me, I recently got a chance to check out the Shudder original Jacob's Wife. It centers around Anne, married to a small-town minister who feels her life has been shrinking over the past 30 years. Encountering the Master brings her a new sense of power and an appetite to live bolder. However, the change comes with a heavy body count. It's starring Barbara Crampton, who you might know from the Puppet Master flicks, and she's definitely right in her element. It's a blood-soaked gore fest that's as schlocky as it is smart. I love the intermarital back-and-forth bickering that kept me laughing as the characters navigated their supernatural road bump, so to say. So don't wait. Get started streaming the best horror, thriller, and supernatural content. Shudder's expertly curated collection includes must-see titles like Vicious Fun, The Mortuary Collection, and PG Psycho Gorman, plus all the best horror documentaries and the hit Creepshow TV series from executive producer Greg Nicotero of The Walking Dead. To try Shudder for free for 30 days, go to shudder.com and use promo code Let's Read. That's SHUDDER.com, promo code LETSREAD.
I used to work as a liaison officer for Samsung, which meant I'd split my time between my home city of San Francisco and the South Korean cities of Seoul and Suwon. And one thing I learned really quickly when I started visiting the country is just how much South Koreans like to drink. I read somewhere that every year, South Koreans drink twice as much hard liquor than Russians. I don't know exactly how true that is, but they're definitely making a good attempt at it, let me tell you. It makes for some fun nights out with coworkers, there's no denying that. Nothing quite forms a bond like stuffing your face with fried chicken and washing it down with tons of beer. But there's also the downside of South Korea drinking culture, and that's how alcoholism is rampant. On more than one occasion, there'd just be some drunk guy in the public getting his butt beat by cops before they'd just throw his barely conscious body into the back of their car. But by far the worst incident of public drunkenness was when I was on the way to work one morning. I get to the platform, and on the other side, this guy is like fall-down drunk. He's singing, cursing at commuters, laughing to himself. All the while, the commuters are just standing there, pretending the whole thing just isn't happening. I hear two or more people growling "중동자" under their breath, which is a Korean word meaning literally addict. But other than that, everyone is just tactically ignoring the guy. Then he gets up, starts waddling around, and people are doing that incredibly big city thing of both pretending he doesn't exist while also moving out of his way. A sea of smartly dressed commuters parts, and this guy walks right up to the edge of the platform, shouts something unintelligible, to me anyway, then throws himself onto the tracks. Thankfully, several people on the platform reach out to him, trying to pull him back up. But every time the drunk man tried to stand up, he fell right down again. The people on the platform couldn't reach him. Then, my train actually arrives. Not on the side the guy was stuck, obviously, so I had little choice but to board before watching this drama unfold through my window. Suddenly I hear this wave of screams as the commuters on the opposite platform started going ballistic. They were louder than I've ever heard anyone scream before, and I swear, the sound was like nightmares distilled. 100 different people thinking they were all about to watch someone die. I could feel it in my chest and in my stomach. People were frantically pointing, and just as I turned to see what they were pointing at, a train barreled into my field of view. The drunk man hadn't been pulled up yet, and I realized there wasn't enough time left. The train was just traveling way too fast. One of the would-be rescuers was leaning quite far over the ledge of the platform, with his upper body directly in the path of the oncoming train. So from where I was sitting, not only was the drunk about to die, but one of the rescuers were too. It was like the one thing you wouldn't want to happen. They say that you never know how you're going to react to a situation until you actually experience it. I wouldn't have thought I'd react the way that I did, but it was almost as if my hands took on a life of their own. They just shot up and covered my eyes. I didn't want to see whatever carnage was about to take place. I didn't want those memories to exist in my head. A few seconds after I heard the sounds of the other train screeching to a halt, I lowered my hands. Through the windows of the other train, I could see that the drunk man was now standing on the platform, totally unharmed. I don't think even I have the vocabulary to communicate the kind of relief that I felt. During those brief seconds when my eyes had been closed, the people had succeeded in pulling him to safety. Everybody lived, and it was nothing short of a miracle. Visiting South Korea was honestly one of the most incredible experiences in my life, and for anyone thinking about visiting, please don't let any of the regional tensions put you off. It really is a unique and incredible place. But I did meet one person who told me what I can only describe as a horror story. So, I was staying in this apartment block that was basically a high-rise filing cabinet. The apartments are tiny, and they're generally only rented by low-income families or used as Airbnbs by low-rent travelers such as myself. I'm headed out from this one place, and there's a guy standing in the hallway smoking a cigarette who's asking me, "Migu?" Which just means, "Are you American?" I tell him yes, and he seems shocked that I spoke okay Korean. I've been learning for years before I visited, but I didn't quite recognize his accent, so I asked him whereabouts in South Korea he was from. He just shakes his head and says, "Boghan," which sort of just means northern place. Only he doesn't mean north of South Korea, because Boghan is basically a nickname for North Korea. Obviously, I'm like, oh my god, because I'd never met a North Korean before, and I end up asking him how he'd come to be in South Korea. This was a big mistake. He goes on to tell me the most heart-wrenching story I'd ever heard. How some cop basically turned up at his family's house one day and told them some distant relative had been convicted of a crime against the government, and because they were related, they were all headed to a prison camp. Then this truck full of soldiers pulls up, they all jump out with guns, and they start rounding up the family. Apparently his mom just told him to run into the woods and never come home, so he did. After that, he said he didn't want to talk about it anymore, but not before adding that his escape meant that his family were most certainly dead. Which, I get it, man. I wouldn't want to talk about it either. It's just awful thinking you can be in Seoul in this incredibly vibrant, bustling place, and less than 30 miles away, there's a country where people are starving, where their lives are like something out of an actual nightmare. I'm a DJ here in South Korea, and because English is not my first language, please excuse me if there are any mistakes here. 20 years ago, I was driving home from a late-night wedding gig. It was around 4:30 a.m., and I was driving south on our equivalent of an interstate highway, when at one point, the retaining walls on each side of the highway grew very narrow due to the road snaking through mountain passes and other tunnel-like places. It's not like a particularly dangerous place to drive, but the blind bends definitely made me a little nervous as I slowed down to traverse them. Good job I did too, because suddenly, out of nowhere, a young woman jumped out in front of my car, and I was forced to slam on the brakes hard. I swear I almost gave myself whiplash, but I managed to stop in time, and I was so angry that I got out of my car to shout at her. What was she even thinking that she was doing? She looked up at me, didn't say a word in reply, then actually ran to the passenger side door and climbed into my car. It was then that I realized that she was evidently running from someone or something. So I freaked out for a second and as many minutes, then jumped back into my car and drove off. I kept asking her, "Are you okay? Who's chasing you?" But she only ever replied with, "I'm sorry, I just need to call my mom. I just need to call my mom." She looked to be in her late teens, with dyed blonde hair and dirty clothes that made it look like she tripped a few times while escaping an attacker. I told her it was okay, that I'd drive her somewhere so she could call her parents, but I couldn't get a straight answer out of her because she was panicking and crying. We'd both seen the figure in my rearview mirror as we drove away. It caused her to scream out, which made me speed up. I thought she might calm down a little so she could tell me what was going on, but she was terrified and just kept saying I need to call Mom whenever she calmed down enough to talk. I know what you're thinking. Why didn't she just use a cell phone? Well, this was a time when not everyone in South Korea could afford cell phones. They were in the market, sure, but to buy even a terrible one would require at least middle-class salaries, so I had to wait until I saw a 24-hour gas station to find anywhere the girl could use the phone. I asked her if she needed any change to use the payphones, but she just looked up at me and said the same thing. I just need to call Mom. I think that's when I realized that something wasn't right. It was literally the only thing she said to me for the entire ride, and when we stopped, she just got out and ran into the grocery store. It was very evident that she was terrified of whoever had been following her, and it was also evident that they were too scared to talk about it, so, trying to be a good citizen, I called the police and told them everything. I kept the car running and kept watching the girl as she used the payphone. The police dispatcher told me it would be around 10 minutes before the police arrived, and I was worried she'd freak out if she found out I'd called them. So, that was what was occupying my mind as I watched the girl put the phone down before she appeared to start walking back towards my car. Suddenly, she stopped, and she turned back towards the gas station as if she'd heard something around the corner of it, which was completely dark and not covered by any lights. I watched as she walked closer and closer towards it, almost like someone was calling her name into the darkness. Then, out of nowhere, I saw a man leap out of the darkness, grab her, then drag her back into it. I immediately put my foot down, zooming around to where she'd been grabbed so I can illuminate the darkness with my headlights. It was a matter of seconds, and I thought I'd see some predator trying to drag her behind a dumpster or something, but there was no one there. No one there at all. It actually took my breath away for a moment. There didn't seem to be anywhere for two people to disappear, just a chain-link fence and the rear of the gas station. So where had they gone? Before I got a chance to look any further, the police showed up, so I ran over to their car and frantically told them what I'd just seen. We searched the area completely. They even checked in the back room of the gas station, but there was no one fitting the description of the girl or the attacker. The police thanked me for filing the report, but told me that there was no longer any reason for me to be there. It was about 5:30 in the morning by that time, and adrenaline was starting to wear off, so I did as I was told and went home to sleep. Naturally, it wasn't the most peaceful sleep of my life, and my first thoughts when I awoke were that that poor girl had been dragged into the shadows. And I never learned of her fate. Nothing was in the news about it, and when I contacted the police about it, they just told me it was under investigation. But the thing that I find really scary about the whole thing is how there was a man chasing her when she got into my car on the highway, and we must have driven at least 5 or 6 miles away from the scene. It couldn't have been the same guy who grabbed her, and there's no way of anyone knowing where we were headed. So how was someone able to find her at the gas station? Was it something to do with the phone call she made? I have so many unanswered questions about this event in my life, and sometimes I feel like it haunts me. I find myself scared of total strangers whose names I didn't even know, and as much as I hope she's okay, somewhere, and what happened was part of some horrible but brief chapter in her life, I have the worst feeling that she's not okay at all. This happened while living in my parents' house about 10 years ago, and for context, I grew up in Seoul, South Korea. My entire family, that's my brother, sister, and parents, were at a baseball game. Baseball is really popular here in South Korea. It was a night game, and being baseball, it ran a little longer into the night. I couldn't go to the game because at the time I was still in high school with a part-time job as a lifeguard, so I'd normally get off at around 9 p.m. The pool was super close to my parents, so I could get home within minutes, but still, I decided to just stay home and chill instead of meeting my family at the game. Anyway, I finally get home and get a shower. I finish up and I'm getting out of the shower and walking into my room, and I hear all this shuffling and running downstairs. So I yell, "Hello?" thinking it's my parents. I then yell, "Mom? Dad?" But again, no one answers. Then I hear footsteps downstairs, and the next thing I know, I hear our garage opening up. You could just manually lift the door at the time because our garage door opener was broken, so I'm really confused for a second, and it's not until I make sure none of their cars are in the driveway that I'm certain that no one is back home yet. In which case, who was just in my house? I threw on a bathrobe, grabbed my keys, then ran across the street to a neighbor's place. Then I got my neighbor and her son, and we all walked through the house with a baseball bat because I was absolutely terrified that someone might have still been there. The neighbor ended up calling the cops, and when we did another walk around, we found that my dad had about 110,000 won stolen. That's about $100, and my mom's diamond rings and earrings were all stolen, and there was a set of earrings lying in the bedroom floor with the jewelry box lid still slightly off, which was by far the most terrifying because it meant I'd interrupted them during the crime. What happened was my parents' house was right in the middle of getting burglarized while I came home. I was in the house with the intruders for some time before they realized I was home and heard the shower running and me starting to yell for my parents, which startled them and made them make a run for it. Hence the footsteps and shuffling I was hearing, and the escape route was through the broken garage door, which they must have scouted outside of our house for some time. The cops said that was the third break-in in our area within the past week, and they have been on the lookout for suspicious people without tipping off the public. Probably one of the scariest things I've had happen to me, though. The moment I realized my parents weren't home and someone else was in the house with me was probably the worst fear I've ever had. It came with like a physical reaction. I legitimately recoiled when I realized that A, I wasn't alone, and B, I was extremely vulnerable. I don't want to give away too much about myself here because I guess I could still be court-martialed for talking about this. But honestly, people need to know about stuff like this, especially in light of some of the more recent information that's been released by the government. So I work avionics on F-22s for the U.S. Air Force, and as you can imagine, most of the work is either done outside or in some big hangar, sometimes pretty late at night too. This one time, I was stationed out in South Korea. It's the middle of the night and we're in the middle of work when we got told to go walk back into the hangar. Not unusual, of course, so we comply without a word. But then, someone orders the hangar doors closed, which raised a few eyebrows. And then, we get told to face the rear portion of the hangar and not look behind us. Anyone who's been in the military will tell you that that's not the kind of order you receive every day, but still, we just do as we're told. But then, not only do all the lights in the hangar get switched off, but the fact that it was dark behind us too meant that basically every light in the entire base had been turned off as well. So, there I am, standing there in total darkness thinking, what in God's name is going on here? When I start hearing this rumbling sound in the distance, it gets louder and louder, and I realize it's a low-flying aircraft, maybe 2 or 3 of them, and they fly super low, super loud right over the top of us. A few minutes later, it's all quiet again, and the lights come on, and we're just told to get back to it. We obviously did a buttload of speculating over what it might be, and the general consensus seemed to be that it was some new top-secret spy plane that was being tested out because their engines sounded slightly different to anything we'd heard before. That seemed like the most rational explanation anyways. I mean, it's not like our officers knew any more than we did, or if they did, they certainly did a good job of hiding it. So anyway, a few years go by. I'm posted somewhere else, but doing basically the same job, when I start seeing stuff on the New York Times website about Lieutenant Commander Alex Diedrich. Diedrich said that back in 2004, she and her co-pilot were tasked with checking out some weird radar signatures that the USS Nimitz was picking up off the coast of Southern California. They first noticed this weird churring in the water before seeing what she described as a smooth, white oblong object resembling a large tic-tac breath mint flying at high speed over the water. This is all in a report that went before Congress. Diedrich isn't some crazy person. In fact, you gotta be incredibly psychologically stable to get to be a fighter pilot to begin with. There's all this talk of normalizing UFO sightings and stuff now, and it's right there out in the open, and no one is talking about it. It just makes me think that we were way too quick to label what happened some super advanced spy plane or whatever, and at the risk of being labeled a nut, I think the government knows way more about these tic-tac incidents than they're letting on. I think we might well be on the cusp of acknowledging that we're routinely visited by extraterrestrials, but whether or not they have good or bad intentions, I suppose only time will tell. I was an army brat, and I grew up pretty much all over the world on various bases in Germany, South Korea, Japan, and obviously back here in America too. I have some pretty crazy stories from my childhood, but only 1 or 2 that are like horror movie level scary. So this is back in 1992. I'm about 10 years old, and we'd just gotten off a plane in Pyeongtaek's airbase in South Korea. As we're walking through one of the arrival buildings, everyone's attention is drawn to what looked like a service lift because a bunch of guys are cutting a hole in it with a giant saw. The whole area is cordoned off, people are freaking out, and it dawns on me that someone's actually trapped in the lift. Obviously, we didn't stand around gawking, but we found out later that a pretty horrifying thing had happened. A cleaner had been using the service lift one night after a shift to go back to the departure area where he could stash his trolley, etc., when the lift breaks down between floors. No problem though, right? Because the emergency help button is there to save the day. I can honestly only imagine how horrified the guy must have been when he realized that no matter how many times he pushed the button, he wasn't getting any response. The thing was busted, and since this is way before cell phones or anything, he realizes he's basically stuck in there until someone else comes along to use the service elevator. Only, he's in the middle of a night shift, and no matter how loud he screams or pounds on the door, no one seems to be able to hear him. Apparently, he wasn't scheduled to be on shift until a whole 24 hours later, so no one thought to look for him. His coworkers just roll up and assume everything is okay, only realizing something's amiss when the service elevator doesn't work. But by that point, he's been trapped inside the elevator for more than 18 hours, and he's getting pretty desperate. He's drank water from his own mop bucket, bearing in mind it's the middle of summer and super hot everywhere, and he's been pounding on the doors, but still no one seems to hear him. So his coworkers know the elevator is busted. They just don't know that he's trapped inside of it, so there's no mad rush to get an engineer or a mechanic out to check on it. 48 hours pass, there's still no engineer to fix the elevator, and they still have no idea where their coworker is. Some of them figured he'd gone into the city to spend his paycheck and hadn't managed to get back in time. But meanwhile, this cleaner had been trapped in a service elevator for 2 straight days. He's starving, he's sick from drinking mop bucket water, and he's had to use one corner of the elevator as a bathroom. Luckily, The engineer gets there, gets the elevator back to the ground, and that's when they realize that a guy is trapped in there after hearing his weak cries begging for help. That's when all the craziness started because they couldn't get the doors open for whatever reason, so out came all the crazy circular saws and stuff. My dad says that he was taken to the hospital with dysentery or something, like he was in a real bad way by the time they got him out. He survived, but he never went back to his job at the airbase, all because one faulty elevator almost cost him his life. I think that's what freaks me out so much about that story, how it was some totally normal everyday thing that almost killed this guy. Like, I know he shouldn't have drunk the mop water, but at the same time, I totally get why someone might panic and do something irrational when faced with such a terrifying situation. I mean, you're just feet away from other people, but at the same time, you might as well be 100 miles away. But yeah, that's the story I tell people every time I choose to take like 3 or 4 flights of stairs instead of just hopping into the elevator. People think I'm crazy for taking the stairs, but it doesn't bother, because I know they're crazy for just casually walking into what could easily become their giant steel coffin. Way back in the 1980s, when I was in the Navy, I was stationed out at Chinhae in South Korea, which is this big old US naval base near the city of Busan. One day, we were way out at sea, performing what we'd call underway replenishments alongside an aircraft carrier. Basically, this is when 2 ships would sail side by side on the same course, very close together, and rig lines and hoses between the 2 ships to transfer fuel and other supplies. In choppy waters, it's as risky as you can imagine, but the whole thing means you can keep carriers and battleships in the fight against a numerically superior force. Cough, the Chinese Navy, cough. So, on this occasion, right as we're running the cables and fuel lines, this little fishing trawler registered to some Russian fishing company comes trundling in between us. He's innocently like, "Hi guys, don't mind me, just doing some fishing." But every time he comes between us, we have to perform emergency breakaways so as not to put him in danger. If it happened just once, you can chalk it up to an accident. But it kept happening all morning. This guy was obviously trying to screw up our exercise, and the fact that he had a Ruski flag on it, I mean, these guys aren't even trying to hide it anymore. But say we legit halted, boarded, then arrested the guys, not only would we look like the jerks, but Putin could just say it was an accident, silly fishermen, but evil imperialist Americans bullying the little fishing boat. Now, around noon, word came down that Brass was going to deal with the trawler. We just didn't know how they were planning on doing so. The 2 ships split off from one another, but then for some reason, the little Russian trawler starts trailing us, like way too close for comfort, too. You get civilian vessels doing some pretty dumb stuff sometimes, mostly just to check out the big cool military ships, but this little Russian dude was acting really suspiciously. I figured the carrier captain would just warn them via radio. As it turns out, he decided on a solution that was considerably more intense. Out of nowhere, we just hear this roaring sound coming out of the clouds. Then 4 fighter jets, afterburners firing, went supersonic over us and the trawler. I wasn't actually topside when the F-14s took off, and even if I was, we were so far from the carrier that the planes would have just looked like little specks in the distance, barely even noticeable. So at first, I had no clue if these planes were Russian, South Korean, or worse, North Korean or Chinese. I think they must have passed at less than 100 feet above us, and believe me when I say the sound was like the very gates of hell opening. I've never heard anything like it before or since. I'm pretty sure none of us had. Those 4 sonic booms in quick succession, you felt each one in your chest, like it was legitimately sounding like the entire world was breaking into pieces. The carrier's captain didn't want to clue the fishing vessel into what he was doing, so he deployed with F-14s without telling anyone on our ship. I think this caused some contention between the 2 commanders following the exercise, but it was definitely exceptional circumstances. They definitely thought the Russian fishing vessel was spying on them, so to my knowledge, there was no disciplinary proceedings that followed. For about 15 seconds, it was absolute mayhem. I knew one boot, who shall remain nameless, who literally wet his pants. He was that scared. Then as soon as we realized it was our own F-14s, we all just fell on our butts with relief. The trawler, on the other hand, there was no relief for them. They turned tail and sailed off at flank speed before our planes could hit them with more sonic booms. I saw some awesome display of power during my time in the Navy, but that was the only time I found out what it might be like to be on the receiving end of some of our weapon systems. And let me tell you, it was just about one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. The market at night near my grandparents' house in South Korea is without a doubt one of the creepiest places I've ever been to. For context, I am Korean American, so I've visited South Korea at least once a year since I was a kid. One time, my grandparents needed something from the market, so they asked my mom to go. Typically, women don't go by themselves at night because, sadly, in rural areas, women have been known to go missing from time to time. So my mom asked me to come with her, since there would be safety in numbers. It was incredibly creepy. There were only about 3 street lamps the whole way. The market itself and the nearby town took up an entire street, and we had to go deeper into the market to get to the store we needed. There wasn't a single woman or kid, only grown men staring at us while they had a drink or cigarette, and all they did was stare at us, shaking their heads and saying mean things in Korean under their breath. The entire time I was only thinking about what my mother and I would do in case any of them decided to get fresh with us. We got to the store we needed to and got the thing, but the storekeeper looked at us really weird, as if he was judging us real hard for being out after dark. Even after we left the store, I could still see him looking at us like we were just scum or something. Eventually, after we passed a group of men sitting on motorcycles, we see them all get up and start following us. At this point, my mom also started to panic and we both practically ran. More like speed walking, but my mom was going as fast as she could. We got on the main road where there were far more people and a lot more streetlight. The men stopped and went back to the motorcycles. I honestly can't tell you how scary that was. The fact that I could have been murdered and my mom possibly assaulted before she was murdered. There's no mistake. Those men were coming after us, and ever since then, neither me or my mom or anyone from my family went to that market at night. I went traveling around Asia a few years ago, mostly Korea and Japan, and in Korea I did most of my traveling by train. That's how I ended up at Jugangano Station in Daegu. While I was there, I ended up seeing this memorial-type thing, and since I didn't have anywhere to be, I thought I'd go over and check it out. What I learned and the things I saw ended up being some of the most nightmarish stuff I've ever heard. In February of 2003, this ex-taxi driver planned to take his own life. But the thing is, he wanted to do it in a public place, to go out with a bang kind of thing. So he goes down into the subway with 2 big milk cartons of gas or whatever, then tries to set himself on fire. Naturally, other passengers freak out and try to stop the guy, because who wants to watch a guy burn to death on their morning work run? But then in a commotion, one of the cartons gets spilled, the guy drops his lighter, and the whole train car gets set on fire. Then, I'm not 100% sure how this happened, but the driver doesn't tell the passengers about the fire for whatever reason, so even though there's smoke and stuff, most of the passengers stay put. Then when the driver learns how bad the fire is, he just bails and takes the train's master key with him, which turned off all the electricity, but also ended up sealing all of the passengers on the burning train. The smoke and fire killed almost 200 people, and I think the train company or the government tried to, cover the whole thing up afterward. It was a huge scandal, and I think the driver only narrowly avoided getting the death penalty for his actions. There's actually a safety-themed theme park in Daegu as a result, and the whole thing is supposed to be a fun way of teaching people about basic health and safety stuff. But the memorial at Jungganganu is seriously one of the most haunting things I've ever seen in my life. There's all this info about the tragedy in both Korean and English, and although the whole subway has been reconstructed after the fire, they preserved this big chunk of wall from the old station. It has a bunch of payphones on it, all burned up and melted from the heat. But the worst things are the messages that people wrote on the walls. After the fire, the families of the victims went down to the burned-out station to write messages to their dead relatives in chalk on the walls. I can't even imagine having to go through something like that, and the whole time I was on the subway from that point on, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Every little light flicker or bump had me practically breaking out in a nervous sweat, and I was really grateful for Tokyo's tram and bus network, which helped me do a little bit more sightseeing while on the move. From the mid-1980s to the early 1990s, the rural South Korean city of Hwasong was terrorized by a merciless and predatory serial killer. Between September of 1986 and April of 1991, a total of 15 women and girls were found bound, gagged, violated, and in most cases, strangled to death with an item of their own clothing, usually their socks, underwear, or pantyhose. The murders prompted the largest criminal investigation in South Korean history, with over 20 million man-hours spent poring over witness statements, analyzing crime scenes, and interviewing over 21,000 suspected culprits. The nightmare began on September 15th of 1986, when a 71-year-old woman named Lee Won-im disappeared while returning home from visiting her daughter. 4 days later, her family's worst fears were confirmed when her body was found dumped on some nearby farmland. Just over a month later, 25-year-old Park Yun-suk vanished after a bus ride back from Songtan. Her body was found just 2 days later, naked and strangled, floating in a local canal. The murders continued month after month for years. Always the same type of victim, always murdered in the same way. It was quite clear that Hwasong had a dangerous and determined serial killer on their hands. The only trouble was, how would they go about catching him? The Hwasong murders are notorious all over South Korea for being the country's first modern serial killer, especially in the sense that a particular modus operandi was applied to all known victims. However, the investigation was so intense and far-reaching that, after just a month's worth of police work, the list of suspects had grown to include a mind-boggling 21,000 different people. On top of that, a whopping 40,000 people had their fingerprints taken, but the true list of suspects could potentially be narrowed down to the few hundred that actually had DNA samples taken from them. Even shorter is the list who had hair samples taken, which is down to a mere 180 different people. Given that the murders had occurred all within a 4-mile radius of downtown Hwasong, hundreds of pairs of police officers and volunteers were positioned within just 100 meters of one another. Their job was to patrol the surrounding area, keeping an eye out for anyone suspicious. But the killer simply worked out where police presence thinned out, and attacked there instead. It seemed that not only were the police unable to prevent the killer from striking again, but the killer himself was unable to resist the urge to hunt and to kill. The first big breakthrough came in September of 1988, when police were able to commission a composite sketch of the suspect, one based on the witness statements of a bus driver and his conductor. He was wiry, a shorter man, aged between 24 and 28 years old, with a sharp nose and short cropped hair. Some victims also described him as having soft hands, which suggested he had a mostly sedentary occupation, possibly as an office or textile worker. This description was corroborated with existing carnal assault reports, and the conclusion was chilling. Their suspect had been engaged in venal, predatory activity for almost a decade prior to killing for the first time, and it became apparent that South Korean police were dealing with one of the most fiendish and prolific criminals in the country's short history. It also appeared that the killer had a bizarre fixation which influenced not only his choice of victims, but also the timing of his attacks. It was noted that the killer's victims had been women wearing red clothing, and that they had been targeted on rainy days, This led some female police officers to set traps for him, walking alone in the greater Hwasong area on rainy days while wearing items of red clothing. Yet it seemed the killer was wise to their ruse and avoided them altogether. The next major breakthrough came on July 27th of 1989, when analysis of a single hair found at one of the crime scenes led to the arrest of a 22-year-old male by the name of Yoon Sung Yao. Yet it was later revealed that this murder was totally unrelated to the others, and as positive as it was that police had caught themselves a murderer, the red clothing-obsessed serial killer was still on the loose, and the attempts to link all previous murders to their one suspect had arguably set the investigation back by years. Not only that, but it was later alleged that South Korean police had brutally beaten and tortured Yoon in their attempts to get a confession out of him. This meant that much of the evidence gained from his interrogations was completely inadmissible, and this caused a huge scandal with the South Korean police force. So much so that in December of 2019, police arrested 8 of the original investigators, charging them with falsifying documents, illegal detention, and physically abusing Yoon when he was in custody. It also became apparent that at least 4 possible suspects actually went so far as to take their own lives as a result of alleged police harassment. So, to say the police mishandled the case would be a grotesque understatement indeed. On the night of September 26, 1989, while the police were still investigating the Hwasong serial killer, a home invasion occurred in the city of Suwon, just 13 miles from Hwasong. The homeowner happened to be awake and confronted the armed burglar before calling the police. The man was arrested, identifying himself as Lee Chun-jae when questioned, and after a short trial in February of 1990, he was sentenced to 18 months in prison. Lee Chun-jae ended up being released after just 6 months, after an appeal hearing in which he claimed to have been the one who was attacked, and he'd simply run into the residence to seek shelter. Yet during those 6 months, something interesting happened. There was not a single new murder that could be attributed to the Hwasong serial killer. Then just a few months after Lee Chun-jae's release, a 14-year-old girl was murdered whilst walking home from school on a rainy day, with investigators quick to note that she was carrying a red backpack. The killer was right under the noses of hundreds of homicide detectives working on the case, yet they failed to make any connections between Lee's imprisonment and the murderer's apparent hiatus. Lee Chun-jae remained quiet for a number of years, minimizing his murderous activities in the face of increasing police pressure. Yet in December of 1993, Lee Chun-jae's wife filed for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences. She was appalled by his prison sentence and noticed how he'd become increasingly withdrawn over the years that preceded his conviction. Little did she know, her husband had been the very same murderous psychopath that had been terrorizing the Hwasong area, and leaving him would only cause the cauldron of evil inside of him to violently boil over. On January 13th of the following year, Lee Chun-jae contacted his 18-year-old sister-in-law, explaining that his soon-to-be ex-wife had forgotten a handful of her belongings. When his sister-in-law turned up to collect them, Lee Chun-jae dragged her inside, brutally violated her, then strangled the life from her. Then, in a sick display of false compassion, he approached his heartbroken father-in-law to offer his help in the search. It's truly horrifying to think that, despite his words, Lee Chun-jae was only there to soak up the family's suffering, to revel in the destruction and anguish he had wrought. Yet in the days that followed, police noted that on multiple occasions, Lee Chun-jae seemed to suggest that his sister-in-law had been abducted and murdered. This was before investigators had any inkling whatsoever of her fate, so the fact that he was so adamant on her abduction was highly suspicious. Lee Chun-jae was also heard to ask, "How many years in prison do you serve for violating someone and murder?" And it didn't take long until the police investigation was focused solely on him. Eventually, on January 18th of 1994, Lee Chun-jae was arrested as the prime suspect in his sister-in-law's murder, and although he initially denied all involvement, he was convicted and sentenced to death in May of the same year. Again, upon his imprisonment, the Hwasong serial killer apparently ceased to operate, but it would take 25 more years for them to connect the dots, and realized that Lee Chun-jae was the monster that they had been looking for all along. On September 18th of 2019, South Korean police official announced that Lee Chun-jae was most likely the Hwasong serial killer. This is based on a DNA match taken from the underwear of one of the victims, and other evidence linked him to almost all of the others. All the police needed to do was coax a confession out of him, and given that he was already detained at Busan prison for the murder of his sister-in-law, investigators had direct, round-the-clock access to the man. It then just took over 2 weeks, but in early October, Lee Chun-jae confessed to killing 14 women and girls over a 6-year period. He also confessed to almost 30 carnal assaults, along with almost 100 attempted assaults that matched up with a number of unsolved reports. Psychologists noted that Lee displayed psychopathic tendencies by being unable to empathize with the victim's pain and suffering, and continuously showing off his crimes. One particularly remarkable aspect of this case is that before it was even solved, it became the basis for a popular South Korean movie directed by Bong Joon-ho, the same guy who directed the Academy Award-winning black comedy Parasite. Song Kang-ho and Kim Sang-kyung star as Detective Park and Detective So, respectively, 2 of the detectives trying to solve the crime, and the film ends with Detective Park looking straight at the camera, trying to spot the killer amongst the audience by using a special eye contact method. Obviously, it implied that the killer was still out there, maybe even watching the film among the audience in question, and audiences were terrified by such a realistic prospect. Fortunately for them, Lee Chun-jae was in prison for the murder of his sister-in-law, meaning moviegoers were safe from his predatory advances. But it definitely speaks to the morbid fascination society has with serial killers, how a horrifying series of murders can so fascinate us that we'll seek to glamorize and serialize it before the killer is even caught. In South Korea, national election days are made public holidays so that citizens get a chance to go out and vote. March 26th of 1991 was a holiday for that exact reason, and given that schools are closed on national holidays, a group of young South Korean schoolboys were out making the most of their day off of school. The 5 boys were from Daosa district of Daegu, and attended the same elementary school, and although they varied in age from 9 years old to 13, they were all the very best of friends. They were 13-year-old Yu Chao-won, 12-year-old Jo Ho-yeon, 11-year-old Kim Yong-yu, 10-year-old Park Chan-in, and 9-year-old Kim Jong-sik. On that particular day, the boys decided to spend the day searching for salamander eggs in the streams of Mount Woryong on the western outskirts of Daegu. A 6th child, 10-year-old Kim Tae-yong, left the group to go home and eat, having missed breakfast that morning. But the next day, the boy discovered that his parents seemed particularly interested in where he'd last seen his friends. The boy was honest and mentioned that they'd been hunting eggs at a certain section of stream, but the answer didn't seem to satisfy. And as much as his parents were trying to protect him from it, it slowly became apparent that something had happened to his friends, something very bad indeed. In fact, none of his 5 friends had returned home that day, and their disappearance sparked a case that would haunt the South Korean national consciousness for years. The story made national headlines. Entire news programs were dedicated to sharing information surrounding the boys' disappearance, and South Korean President Roh Tae-woo sent over 300,000 police and military troops to search for the boys. They searched reservoirs, irrigation waterways, bus terminals, and stations nationwide. The fact that the boys were looking for salamander eggs was soon disregarded, as rumor and conjecture replaced salamanders with frogs. Soon the boys were looking for frog eggs. Therefore, in the national consciousness, they became the Frog Boys. Many of the Frog Boys' parents even quit their jobs to search for their children full-time, with the area they disappeared, Mount Woryong, being intensively searched more than 500 times. A series of companies and civic groups made monetary donations totaling 42 million won, or $35,000, as a reward to those who found the boys. But in the years that followed, no one was ever able to lay claim to the reward. With a total lack of evidence or clues regarding the boys' whereabouts, Korean media outlets began to make grim speculations as to the boys' fate. Some journalists at Korea's Junang Daily News made incredibly spurious and irresponsible claims that the boys had been kidnapped by a mentally ill person, despite the fact that there was absolutely nothing to back this claim up. Police would receive hundreds of tips over the years that followed, but none would yield any significant results. The only truly intriguing tip was from a man who claimed to be responsible for the crime. This sick individual claimed to have abducted the children and was keeping them barely alive as prisoners in some unknown location. He chillingly declared that they were alive, but not well. Not much else is known about the fraudulent tipster, but he too was ruled out of the investigation as it became clear that he was only interested in conning the police and the boys' parents out of the 42 million won reward. It took 11 years for any developments in the case, but eventually, in September of 2002, a man searching for acorns in Mount Waryong came across a horrifying sight. In an anonymous phone call to emergency services, the man reported that he'd stumbled across the bodies of 5 dead and decaying children. When police showed up to close off the crime scene, it was confirmed shortly after that the bodies belonged to those 5 missing schoolboys that had gone missing all those years ago. At first, investigators speculated that the boys had gotten lost before dying of hypothermia during the night. But the boys' parents completely rejected the idea, claiming their boys knew the area well enough to find their way home under any circumstances. They demanded a full inquiry into their sons' deaths, with particular focus on why some of the boys' clothes seemed to have been tied into knots. What's more, the boys were just a few minutes' walk from a village they knew well, so to their parents, it was clear that some kind of foul play was at work. Lo and behold, forensic experts later found the skulls of 3 of the boys had been fractured by blunt force trauma, possibly inflicted by a small metal tool. This led homicide detectives to conclude that they had been murdered by someone who, according to them, had flown into a rage. But what could have the boys done to incur such wrath? Multiple theories have cropped up over the years, some more plausible than others. One of the more likely explanations is that the boys were killed by older bullies who, upon realizing just what they'd done, fled the area and never spoke of it again. There was also a military firing range just a mile or so away from where the bodies were found, suggesting they could have possibly been hit by a stray round. However, given that the day they vanished was a national holiday, it seems unlikely that any kind of formal shooting practice would have taken place that day. Other more terrifying theories include the idea that the boys had been killed by a group of local lepers, who then extracted their livers under the assumption that consuming them would cure or otherwise alleviate the symptoms of their crippling disease. We can speculate all we want, but the fact remains that the cause of death remains a complete mystery, making the case of the murdered frog boys one of the most notorious cold cases in South Korean history. We can only hope that sometime soon, developments in forensic and other investigative technologies reaches a point where we can finally deliver justice to the monster who killed those boys, then covered it up. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/Let'sReadOfficial, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations for just $1 a month on Patreon, and maybe even pick up some Let's Read merch on Spreadshirt. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all these stories in big compilations and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. All links down in the description below. Thanks so much, friends, and I'll see you again soon.